Clockwise?
Well, not the plot, but I mean, where, you can, how can I say it? Give us a little bit more about it. I mean, so he's out looking for somebody after, 60 years of doing other stuff. And, how's he accepted being a vampire himself? I mean, that's out of curiosity.
When we first meet Jack, we actually meet him at the crime scene in the first book. So there's a dead city councilman. There's a woman beside him. The councilman is dressed up like JFK, like Kennedy. The dead woman is dressed up like Marilyn Monroe. No one has any idea what's going on. Jack hits the scene, and the lead homicide detective knows Jack by reputation. Not quite sure what he is. Doesn't quite trust him. He doesn't think he's a vampire or anything like that. He has no idea about the supernatural world. He just knows Jack is a bit off. But he also knows that Jack gets results. So when Jack Strayhorn hits the scene, every vampire in the book has a unique power, and Jack's is his sense of smell. So he can look at the bodies. He takes he can inhale, take a sniff, and he can just decode everything he senses and get all these clues about the murderer, what happened. Starts to break it all down. So that's when we meet Jack. He's arriving on the scene. He's kind of reading the clues of these two dead bodies and trying to get a sense of what happened. So we see him at work, his process right away, and that was me trying to hook the reader, bring them right into Jack's world. What's going on here?
Oh wow! Now I got to ask you a question. You had your first drink when you were around 17.
17, yes. I was a late bloomer for alcoholics, but 17 was my first drink.
And how many years were you drinking before you realized that you needed help?
Well, the odd thing is I kind of hit the ground running, and I knew when I got to college a year and a half later that I had a problem, but I was not at all equipped or ready to deal with it. So I was very good at making up excuses for myself. I was just, I'm young and partying in college. Everybody does it, et cetera, et cetera. But that first drink was a blackout. I mean, I blacked out. I puked. It was a bad scene. But I immediately wanted to do it again. Now that should have been a glaring red flag to anybody. Most people would be like, you know what? Not for me. That was not enjoyable. So I knew right away that I didn't drink like other kids, other people my age, and I was not ready to deal with it, not for another at least 13 years.
Wow, too. I can see that happening. But during this whole time frame, I guess you were maybe writing, stories and putting them in notebooks and stuff like that. And you really...
I was.
Yeah, all that time you were on your drinking binge, you really didn't have nothing to show for it other than what you were writing.
No, I had a lot of unfinished short stories. I had a lot of journals with story ideas and snippets of dialogue and character studies. My instincts for writing and my creative instincts are really there's the one thing I didn't lose, one thing that kept me going, even if it was just, it had been reduced to, me scribbling in a notebook every night. It was the one thing I had, and I didn't lose it, and I think that's why I survived those years. But yeah, I was not giving it any room to grow. I was not feeding that flame with anything healthy. So consequently, I never got, any of my bigger ideas fleshed out and finished. What's a writer without a book? So it's just, not doing it.
Yeah, so you basically, start writing your stories and go out drinking and then forgot about your stories? And was it in a situation like that? I'm trying to place it in my head out there for the listeners can figure this out a little bit.
I had a very dangerously delusional romantic idea of what a writer was. And to me, that was Hunter Thompson. You can get drunk or high and write something brilliant. And it never worked out, but like any good alcoholic, I kept trying the same thing over and over again, even though I kept getting the same bad results. So, I'd get a good idea, I'd scribble it down, I would tell myself every day I'm going to get back to that, I never get back to it, when I sat down to scribble something else again, it was a totally different idea. It was very chaotic. But it's this vicious cycle of making no progress. Oh, here's another idea. I'll get to that later. Oh, here's another idea. Just on and on again, night after night.
Well, how were you supporting yourself during this 13-year period?
Well, I started out working typical 20-something jobs. A lot of kids do when they're trying on their way to get to somewhere else. Waiting tables, working in coffee shops. But I kept doing that, and the jobs kept getting progressively worse and worse, as did my living situations. I would just get lower and lower run jobs that had fewer responsibilities. Until I was just working whatever part-time thing I could do that would, last a week or what have you. And it was just getting more and more erratic. And I, was borrowing money and not paying it back, and no way to live.
Well, how was
at one point I was like...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, at one point I had this door-to-door sales job where I was soliciting contributions to some environmental campaigns. And I realized one morning that I showed up for work with this crew of other, fellow reprobates. And on our way to our first stop, I had to get out of the car and throw up on the sidewalk. And it didn't faze anybody that I was working with. They just accepted it as, it's another day. And that's when I realized, it was one of the first moments of clarity, as they say. Like, who have I fallen in with that this is normal behavior?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, if you're I hate to say it, some of those crews are basically same. They got drug problems. They have alcohol problems. They're just, trying to get enough money, to, I guess, survive and get another drink. Were you in that situation at that point?
I was. I was fortunate in that I never crossed that line into the criminal life to support what I was doing. But I had definitely drifted and allowed myself to drift down to the bottom rung. I mean, it's just a no ambition life at that point.
And you went to how far in college did you go?
Oh, I have a BA in English literature.
Oh, wow. So how did your family take all this, out of curiosity? I mean, some families, I hate to say it, they're dysfunctional, and they just kind of just pass it off like there's nothing, because they don't even realize what's going on themselves because they are so dysfunctional. How about your family? How did they take your, drinking issues and stuff like that?
I think it was really hard for my family to recognize. Because, my family has its own addiction issues and history of addiction. I think our baseline for what that is probably pretty dysfunctional. But I also, my family also had a kind of a hands-off policy, you gotta let people make their own decisions. And so it was very easy for me to hide the worst of it from them. So I think to this day, they actually don't know most of the details of how bad it got.
Oh, wow. Now, I'm sure it had to affect relationships and friendships and everything else. We already covered the job issue. That's one thing that, it covers. Now, this is what actually, writing this one book, was it 12 Stakes or whatever that is that the one?
Well, 12 Stakes is the series. One Death at a Time was that first book. And
that's what made you turn around and were you already in rehab at that point, and that's when you wrote it? Or I'm just curious.
I literally wrote the character sketch for Jack Strayhorn in the cafeteria of my rehab, and the book idea itself didn't come together until it was the first 2 weeks when I got out of rehab. I was talking to a friend of mine, another writer. His name's Con Ho. He was kind of joking around about how to use this experience that I had just been through in my writing. And he kind of half jokingly said, "Oh, you should write about vampires in AA." And something about that comment and the character sketch I'd already done for Jack, suddenly these two things just melded together in an instant, and the book was just unfold from there. I had the story, I had the character, I had the world building details. It just downloaded at once, and it was incredible.
Well, I mean, I guess maybe going through what you've gone through, you got your life focused in knowing what you wanted, and it sounds like things have turned around for you drastically. The book sounds so interesting. I mean, I'm still wondering, do you get any weird hate mail or anything from your book? I mean, this vampire thing, you really touched on something out there. It's really, there's some major occults out there in it, and that's why I was just kind of curious. And just kind of curious.
I haven't gotten any major hate mail. I have gotten a lot of, and it's funny that you bring up the cults. I have gotten people who are taking issue with my presentation of the vampires. Well, this is vampires don't do this. They don't do X, Y, Z. This is not a good representation. You don't know what you're talking about. Real vampires aren't like this. So it's kind of a cross between pedantic fans and lunatics, but it's very interesting. And for me, it's all engagement as far as I'm concerned.
Well, some of these people, when they're saying vampires don't do that, do they sound like they're one of these vampires like I was telling you about at the beginning of our conversation? Or is it somebody that just watches a lot of sci-fi and, Comet, the sci-fi Comet station? Oh, no, the true fantasy horror fans are always welcoming a new take on the vampire. So I haven't had any issues there. They're just, hey, if you got a new vampire character for me, he hasn't been done 100 times, great, I want to read it. The people who take issue are the ones you're talking about, the self-identified vampires. And I have learned it's best to keep a flexible mind. I think there is something out there right now, this idea of the vampire character, in that I do think there are people who are emotional vampires, for lack of a better word. Like this is just a emotional psychic phenomenon that exists, and maybe we deal with it by turning it into the literal vampire bloodsucker character in order to understand it. The addict, the alcoholic, the horrible opioid epidemic going on in our country, this is another way to understand it as well. I think that touched a nerve with a lot of people. If they can begin to get inside the addict's mind through a fantasy story, it kind of makes it easier. So a lot of ways, I think it's just touching on something, as you said, it's out there right now in the collective consciousness. Oh yeah, that's one thing. Like this one person, actually, I had a lady too. The same thing. She is a vampire, and she goes, that her friends again. They come over and they have like a feeding party, and where they bring people in. They cut themselves.
Party sounds so festive.
Yeah, it does, but I don't know. It's just hepatitis and all this stuff. I would think you're really risking your life, but I how can I say it? How this one guy, he lives his whole life, in his apartment. That's pretty much how it's gotten to be, where he won't go outside because he's scared that he'll burn, that he's so pale and all that stuff. And probably he's so anemic as hell, pardon my language, that he doesn't even probably have the strength to walk outside and go anywhere.
Probably, but I mean, this is how this is one of the things I write about. I mean, that guy sounds to me like your typical heroin junkie / crackhead. Like there's a lot of parallels there.
Well, it does. In this case, it's
the mind we're dealing with.
Yeah, in this case where people have to come over and feed him, and that's his whole life. It's basically living to consume blood. Again, the one guy I talked to, very educated, and he got into it accidental. Again, he originally had a drinking and drug problem, and somehow he got off the drugs and went into this. So he probably went from one extreme situation, I guess, is probably as extreme as you can probably get.
Mm-hmm. Replace alcohol with blood. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, can I have blood with my? No, thank you. Wow. So, are you going to stay pretty much in the vampire series, or is it going to go into other creatures of the night or things like that too down the road?
Like I said, this series does incorporate. There's the werewolf characters. You meet them in the first book. There's the werewolves are they're called the Dogs of War. They're outlaw